Now let's look at fats in the body in terms of where we use and where we store it, and what that can mean for our health. Most fat is absorbed by the cells that make up the lining of our small intestines. These cells can of course use fats themselves as energy and building material, but mostly they repackage fats or fatty acids and send them to the liver via the bloodstream or the lymph vessels. Your liver can also use the fat for energy or as building material. It can also store the fat, although this is not what the liver is designed for, and if it happens too much, can be harmful. We can get a condition that I studied a lot for my PhD called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, or of course if it's combined with alcohol, it could be alcoholic fatty liver. Mostly though, the liver repackages the fat that it doesn't use as energy and sends it back into the bloodstream. Other cells then get to use the fat for energy, building material, or they can simply store it for later use. And there is another fate for fat in the liver. It can be partially broken down and converted by the liver and to a lesser extent the kidneys to another form known as ketones, which can then be readily used as energy throughout much of the body. At this point, it's important to clarify something. Eating fat does not, in and of itself, make you fat. In fact, fats are essential, at least some are, the essential fatty acids. Eating more than your body can handle, really of anything, forces it to store extra fat. What happens initially is the body changes metabolism to basically use energy wastefully. But over an extended period of time, or if there are certain problems or diseases of metabolism, then basically excess energy from whatever source ends up as stored fat. Now, it's not as simple as some people make it out to be, but it's important for now to just recognize that excess glucose from carbohydrate-containing foods and even excess protein can be converted to fat for storage. And that's because our bodies can store a fairly limited amount of glucose. It can't really store protein at all. Proteins are all basically in use, whereas we can store a lot of fat. That stored fat provides a lot of energy for a given weight, just over twice as much as protein or carbohydrates. So per gram, about slightly more than twice as much energy than carbohydrates or protein. But fat gives up that energy more reluctantly, if you like, than carbohydrates, less easily. Think of fat as a slow-burning hardwood log on a fire. It burns for a long time and gives off a lot of heat, but it takes a decent fire to get it burning in the first place. Whereas carbohydrates, the topic of the next set of modules, can be a little bit more like kindling. It can be used quite readily, but isn't as long-lasting a form of energy. Some of our energy is always coming from fat, but the proportion varies depending on how hard we're working physically and how healthy our metabolism is, and we'll touch on that again in future modules. Now, although fat contains a lot of energy by weight, fat stored in our body takes up a lot of space. Here you can see a comparison of fat versus muscle. Both would weigh the same amount, but the fat is bigger, it takes up more space. Keep this difference in mind if you're or someone else you know is trying to get leaner with diet and exercise, or really any other way. With the right approach, you or they should be building a little muscle while reducing fat. The results on the scale may be a bit disappointing, but the results in the mirror and in terms of measurements should be more pleasing. Let's put fat storage and energy into context. Consider that a 70 kilogram person with 20% body fat, so that's lean for a non-athlete, has sufficient energy stored as fat to run over 21 marathons and still have a little fat left over. Now, that's not realistic. I'm not suggesting anyone who's 70 kilograms and 20% body fat could, without eating, run back-to-back marathons. And certainly not 21 of them. But theoretically, that's how much energy is there, and there's still a little bit left over. So even a relatively lean person has a lot of energy stored as fat. So despite the signals our bodies might be sending us, we have plenty of energy tucked away, even if we don't eat for quite a while. The problem for many of us is that our bodies are no longer good at using that energy. They're no longer good at using fat. They're not incapable of it, but they're not very efficient at it, and they might very well prefer to use carbohydrates, glucose as energy. And that's a topic we will also discuss in another module. So where is all that fat stored? Well, you can see in these scans that fat can be stored in different places. We call the fat under the skin subcutaneous fat. and that around our organs, visceral fat. Sometimes you'll also hear the technical term adipose tissue, which simply means tissue made up of fat cells, so specialized fat storage cells. Years of research suggest that subcutaneous fat, especially around the hips, is relatively benign when it comes to health, and certainly some may be quite health beneficial, especially in women. When it starts to add a lot of weight to our frame, our joints can suffer, but otherwise it doesn't seem too damaging for our health because it mostly just sits there minding its own business. Visceral fat, on the other hand, so that's the fat around the organs, is much more active, biochemically active, metabolically active. It can, for example, increase inflammation in the body. And it can become leaky in the sense that it doesn't do a very good job of storing fat if it's stressed with basically too much fat. Where fat is stored matters. You may have observed that some people are more apple-shaped and others are more pear-shaped. Some are hourglass-shaped, probably more consistent with the pear. The apple shape suggests more visceral fat, more fat around the center, around the organs, and therefore a bigger waist. And this is generally associated with poorer health and therefore worse health forecasts than the pear shape, where we're looking at someone, usually female, carrying weight, fat more around the hips. Apple and pear-shaped people, however, have obvious fat. Not all fat in the body is so obvious. Take these two gentlemen, for example. They both have a body mass index, or BMI, so that's weight divided by height, well within the normal range. Okay, 22.3. Happen to both be identical on that front. They're also both fairly lean, but one is substantially leaner than the other, meaning has a lower body fat percentage. You can't see the fat on either one of them, especially when they're clothed, but even in the scans it's not that obvious. So outward appearances can be deceiving. That brings me to another important point. Body fat is never measured. It's only ever estimated. There are always some underlying assumptions that may or may not be true for any given individual with any technique used for estimating body fat. So while the better techniques for estimating body fat, such as DEXA, MRI scans, and even some of the better bioelectric impedance devices, can be very useful to get approximations, they're best used to track relative changes over time. Is someone getting leaner over time, or are they putting on more body fat over time? So please avoid getting too fixated on any exact numbers. Here is perhaps a more striking example that outward appearances don't tell the whole story. These are magnetic resonance images of two people. Imagine being able to look directly down onto someone's head but seeing through them to the point roughly in line with their belly button. That's what we're seeing here. The back of the person is toward the bottom of the screen, and fattier parts of the image are lighter, with lean parts darker. Look at the two images and then the numbers. Do any of these things surprise you? One of these people has a BMI that puts them in the overweight category, BMI of 28. The other person is just 1 point below being labelled as morbidly obese. They have a BMI of 39. 40 would be classed as morbidly obese. I'm not a fan of BMI because it can certainly get it wrong, but in this case, it illustrates a very important point. You can see with the BMI of 28, a body fat of 20%, and it's pretty good. Lean, as I said, for a non-athlete. You wouldn't expect washboard abs with that kind of body fat percentage, but you wouldn't expect the person to look visibly over fat. On the other hand, a body fat of 45% is pretty serious. Now, that's approaching half of the body mass being fat, right? So 5% shy of that. What we can also see is that there isn't very much difference in the visceral fat, although we don't have an exact estimate here. Right? So it's roughly, both people have a decent amount of fat around their organs. It's important to note that we regard a liver fat above 5% as high. We regard that as being a fatty liver. So the fact that both people have a similar liver fat is striking given the noted differences in the overall fat levels. Again, just illustrating the point that we can't judge a book by its cover. And this is a nice example in which we can see the actual livers. Despite fairly similar amounts of subcutaneous fat, the liver fat varies noticeably, as shown by the relative lightness of the liver on the left, indicating more fat, versus the dark liver on the right, indicating very little fat. Now that we have these relatively reliable ways of measuring fat in the organs, or really fairly accurately estimating fat in the organs, it looks like this fat can be particularly problematic in terms of health. Excess fat in the liver is associated with liver insulin resistance, so the hormone insulin doesn't have the same effect it should or to the same degree, and this can progress to more serious liver disease. Excess fat in the pancreas is associated with reduced capacity for insulin release, the other side of the coin. There are also changes in heart metabolism in response to excess fat storage there. And this fat storage in the organs, when it goes above just a small amount of fat being stored for future energy use, is called ectopic fat. Ectopic meaning it doesn't belong, fat where it doesn't belong. These new imaging technologies are beginning to suggest that although visceral fat and fat within the organs themselves often go hand in hand, often when visceral fat is high, ectopic fat, so fat in the organs, is also high. When we can tease their effects apart, the fat in the organs may be doing more harm than the fat around the organs. Consider this: the difference in fat between the pancreas in someone with active type 2 diabetes and someone who has reversed their diabetes is roughly 1 gram. Now, the pancreas is not a huge organ, but still, that's only 1 gram of difference between the person who has type 2 diabetes where it's still active, the disease process is going on, and in someone who's essentially reversed all the obvious signs and symptoms. Just 1 gram. The key message here is where we store fat is more important to health than how much we store. Simple measures like body mass index tell us nothing about this, and even looking at a person tells us very little. We might expect someone who's obviously over fat to have more ectopic fat, have more visceral fat, but that isn't necessarily the case. Obvious question might be, does eating fat make us fat? Well, we'll cover this more when we look at energy, but for now, no, eating fat does not make us fat. Not by itself. Eating more energy than our bodies use makes us gain weight over time, but the relationship is somewhat complex. We'll revisit this in future modules on dietary approaches and on energy. We will discuss diets that are very high and very low in fat, for example, as well as some of those that are in between and what the research is showing us about those.